Welcome everybody to this year's Global Middle Ages seminar at the Bard Graduate Center. We're meeting virtually, but at least that gives us a suitably global audience. I'm François Louis, professor of Chinese art and material culture here at BGC. And I'm co-convening today's event with my colleague, Itai Weinrib, who is professor of medieval European art and material culture at BGC. Itai will moderate the second part of today's event. We're fortunate to have two eminent scholars speak to us on global interconnectedness during the period of about 900 to 1400. So it's a time period which in Chinese studies we call the Middle Period. And we'll have both speakers present their talks back to back, and then have a discussion and Q&A. Our first speaker is Valerie Hansen, Stanley B. Woodward Professor of History at Yale University, where she teaches Chinese and world history. In fact, she just came right out of a class 10 minutes ago, as I understand. Valerie received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1987 and has been at Yale since 1988. She's a tireless and efficient organizer of conferences and workshops, which have resulted in 3 edited volumes, a website, some 40 articles, and 6 books, which increasingly have broader and broader appeal. Let me just single out her widely used textbook, The Open Empire, History of China to 1800. Here is a copy. This came out in 2000, but was edited and revised and enlarged in 2015. Both in this and in her other books, she presents history broadly without losing insight into the human experience. More recent work includes the summation of her work on the Tarim Basin, the Silk Road, A New History with Documents, 2012, and most recently in 2020, a history of international encounters entitled The Year 1000, When Explorers Connected the World and Globalization Began. She is going to be talking about an aspect of that work. So, without further ado, I'll invite Valerie to pull up her PowerPoint.
Thank you for the generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to see you. Some of, I was gonna say one of my favorite collaborations has been our long-running shared interest in the Liao dynasty. I'm very glad to give this talk, which was originally scheduled for a year ago, because I take this as yet another sign that we're coming to the end of our year of COVID and going forward. So I'm going to be talking about this one sea route. Let me start with a map, just to orient everybody. This is the route that connected China with I was going to say the Middle East, West Asia, and also the East African coast. And you can see here the mileage of different legs of this route. And I think when we think about the just the medieval, well, I was going to say the global Middle Ages. To me, I think this map is part of what we should be thinking about. The route did not go to Europe. I mean, there were overland extensions into Europe, but this sea route covered a huge distance, and there was regular traffic on it. And I'll be talking about that today, and particularly the opportunity for patterns and motifs to move along this route. This is a map of the China under the Sung dynasty, and initially the Sung controlled this whole region, and then they lost North China in 1126. And the loss of North China occurred at the same time as a huge economic boom that I'll be talking about, the Sung Commercial Revolution. And Francois expressed dismay about how many slides I have, but I wanted to show very quickly to give you, those of you who are not Chinese historians, just an impression of what the kinds of commercial developments that were occurring in China during the Sung dynasty. And the key to all of these developments was agricultural innovation. This picture from the Freer, a little bit after the Sung, shows, you can see these farm workers are pedaling, and they're pedaling water that's being carried up. This is a nori, a water wheel. Water is being carried from one field to another. And you can see this where they're growing rice. And these and other agricultural innovations increased agricultural productivity and freed many people from having to work the land. One of the things that is notable about Song is that this was an era of widespread woodblock printing. And you can see here that with a woodblock printing block, you print the images in reverse, and then you put a piece of paper on the block and make an impression. In the Song dynasty, the Chinese had also invented movable type. And we know this because we have a description of it, a verbal description. This is a replica, like a reconstruction of how that type worked. The earliest extant movable type printed book was made in Korea, and this is a picture of it, and it was made long before, well, I was going to say it was made about 80 years ahead of the Gutenberg Bible, but we know that the movable type printing was in use in earlier centuries. The Sung Commercial Revolution, one of the marks of it is a huge increase in the production of iron and steel. And here's a picture of an iron pagoda to just give you a sense of the high level of metal production in the Sung. And Sung China's metal production basically was the highest in the world until England attained that same level in 1700. Part of what was going on in the commercial revolution, it was the massive minting of coins, of bronze coins, and the number of coins minted per person per year increased dramatically during Sung. There was also the use of paper money that was, and you can see at the top of the paper money, this is a picture of a coin, and paper money's introduced in the Sung and becomes widespread in the 12th century. So these are all signs of how advanced China's economy was. This painting, the Chimney Scroll, which is sometimes called China's Mona Lisa, was painted, we know for sure, before 1186. Jonathan Hay from NYU has proposed that it dates to around the year 1000. And it gives us a mental vision of what China and China's economy looked like at the time. This is the famous bridge scene on the painting. And if you look, you can see this is a detail of the bridge, that there are multiple shops crowding the two sides of the bridge. This is a hardware store, which, for example, has the detail is so good in the scroll, you can see that this is a pair of scissors with exactly the same shape as these archaeologically excavated scissors. This is a big building that was an inn. It was also this is in the Chimney Scroll. It was also the site of the wine monopoly. It was a main branch of the wine monopoly. This sign tells us that. And I was going to say, one of the interesting things about the Chimney Scroll, which I think is an imaginary cityscape, I don't think it shows any particular Chinese city, is that there's not much evidence of foreign trade or foreigners in the scroll. And the scroll offers an idealized portrait of a Chinese city in the Sung dynasty, so that may not surprise us that there's not much evidence of foreign presence. I think in reality, we would, depending on the city, we would see much more foreign presence. But this is a store selling, this is a word, a general word in Chinese, xiang, which nowadays means incense, but historically it meant anything having to do with fragrance or emitting fragrance. So fragrant wood, incense, and these were these were the main things that China was bringing in from the outside world. This is another detail from the Chimney Scroll that shows a furniture shop. And here's the sign that I translated in the slide. And these are all imported woods and frankincense. These were all goods coming in from Southeast Asia, and some of them from the Arabian Peninsula. The Chimney Scroll also has some detailed pictures of boats. It's painted in the style of jiehua, or defined borders. And so the painter who made the painting was particularly skilled at showing the structures of houses. We saw the bridge and of these boats. And we can see some of the things that contributed to Chinese dominance of that route that I showed you in the Song Dynasty in this painting. These ships have movable rudders, meaning that if the water is shallow, you can lift the rudder up. If it's deeper, you can put it down. The boats had wooden compartments, and this was an innovation because if a leak sprang in one part of the boat, it didn't necessarily sink the whole boat. You can see the mast. And then these are in the Chimney Scroll, these are unusual oars at the bow and stern of the boat and not on the side. We have archaeologically excavated examples of these Chinese ships. And this example, which sank in 1276, 1277, has evidence that it traveled to Southeast Asia, because the boats that were made in Southeast Asia did not use nails. And so to attach planks, the craftsmen used dowels and wood to attach them. And so some of the repairs were using these techniques. And there's some evidence of resin from Southeast Asia. And, these were, I think it's easy for us to take the boats for granted, but these were really technological marvels. This boat was over 100 feet long. Of course, it was capable of carrying a lot of cargo. And we have a manual that was first composed in the 10th century and gets revised through the 14th century, talking about the things that the government needed, or that you needed to build boats. And you can see that lumber is, of course, the main thing, but also thread and cords and ropes, lime for caulking, oil, and then the metal for nails and for the iron anchors. So that the commercial revolution allowed for the production of these impressive boats. The Chinese had figured out, around the year 1000, they knew how to make magnetic needles, and then we know that they were using them on shipboard in the early 12th century. And their exports, so the Chinese are exporting high-fired ceramics. I'll be talking a lot about ceramics for the rest of the talk. Also metals, also high-quality textiles, but the textiles don't survive in most archaeological contexts, in most shipwrecks, so we know less about them. The metals sometimes survive. And I wanted to show you, these are some slides from a trip I took in 2016 in Fujian province to a kiln that's been in operation for 1,000 years. So it's a Sung Dynasty kiln, just to give you a sense of the industrial scale of the production of Chinese ceramics. And the kiln this kiln is fired by wood. Historically, the Sung kilns were also fired by coke and coal. The Chinese had deforested a lot of the areas, especially around the capital. This is another view, side view of the kiln. And then this is preparing the vessels for firing, and they're being glazed, and then they're going to be placed in these containers and then placed inside the kiln. Here you can see it, another shot. Here's the stacked containers. And when the firing was underway, the potters looked in through these holes to see, and they could judge when the pots had attained the desired high temperatures. These are the highest fired ceramics in the world at this time. They're attaining temperatures of over 1100 degrees centigrade. And this is the inside of the kiln, and you can see that it goes up the wall, the floor of the kiln goes up the side of the hill. And this name of this place is Dehua. And this was one of the major regions exporting ceramics during the Song. So now we get to the export trade, and and where we can see the evidence we have for the export trade and the different locations where Chinese ceramics have been found on this route. And the first place I'd like to talk about is a shipwreck that Francois is much more knowledgeable than I am. I think everything I know about Beilitung, I know from Francois. But this is a map showing you that where this ship sank, it dates to before the period, well, to the 826, 827. And there are many things that are striking about the Beilitung wreck, but one of the most impressive things is just the quantity of ceramics were found on board. So you can see here, there were 57,500 ceramics. 55,000 are these type of changsha wares. And these have motifs, like this one here has in pseudo writing, not in real Arabic, the word for Allah. And so, or something that looks like that. And so we can see that there's already a Chinese export industry in ceramics at this early time. It's very possible that this was not controlled by the Chinese, that buyers were coming. The Beilitung boat was a dhow, so it was not a Chinese style vessel. Buyers were coming from maybe the Middle East, maybe Southeast Asia, and purchasing these large quantities of ceramics and then shipping them. And the ship sank near in modern Indonesia. And so we don't know where it was on its way to, but most people think it was probably on its way to Java. Here's the detail of that, the vessel that I think offers a very clear example of clearly an export ware of writing aimed at Arabic reading consumers. We also have early evidence that of these motifs of copies being made of Chinese ceramics by local potters. This is from the Beilitung wreck. And then this is a later copy. It's in the Yale Art Gallery. And you can see here that this similar motif, and of course, the blue on white, the Chinese vessels have the advantage that they're higher fired. And so the white glaze is smoother and shinier. The copies from the knockoffs don't have that same shininess. And then this is, you could fill this in here that it was blessings to the owner and made by, and then the name of the potter. So we know that this is aimed at Arabic reading consumers. The next comparison I'd like to make of two pots is from a site in Iran, modern day Shush, historically called Susa. And these are two pots that are on display in the Louvre next to one another. And I mean, I ask you, which is the original and which is the knockoff? They're from exactly around the year 1000. And this is the Chinese original pot. And then this is the local knockoff. Again, the white glaze is not as successful or as smooth, as unblemished as the Chinese glaze. Something that's very interesting about this comparison is that the Chinese pot has a motif on it that's aimed at, this flower motif is aimed at Middle Eastern consumers. It's not an indigenous Chinese motif. So we can see already that there are originals, but the originals are being made for a foreign, a non-Chinese audience, and then the purchasers are copying these certain aspects of these vessels. This is an attempt, I think, to copy the Chinese sansai, the three colored glazes. The last couple of examples that I'd like to show you are from the East African coast, and they come from the research of a researcher based in France whose name is Zhao Bing, and who has written about the export of Chinese vessels to East Africa. And this is a diagram from one of her articles showing the movement of the winds, and also showing the extent of the trade on the East African coast, that because these places are all affected by the monsoon winds, that traders were able to take the ceramics this far south. And then if you go down farther on the East African coast, there are much smaller cities and ports because they're not part of this global, or I guess I should say trans-regional, not yet global network. And around the earliest examples of Chinese pots that we see on the East African coast date to the thousands. And you can see here, these are Zhao Bing's drawings of these different pots, but these are all shards from pots that originally looked something like this. This vessel is in the Met, and is a very good example of the commodity that was so prized at the time because of, just for their sheer beauty, but also they were so easy to clean, right? These high-fired white vessels had great appeal all along that route that I'm talking about. Zhao Bing has identified 4 periods of different kinds of ceramics that were popular in different periods. And the second phase is Longchen, as these celadon wares. And this example from the Royal Ontario Museum was not found in East Africa, but it's typical of the kind of Longchen ware that has been found. And the final phase is when blue and white made in Jingdezhen comes to predominate. And so I was going to say I've been talking about a topic, or several topics that I talk about in this book that I published last year, that talks about this new system of global pathways that formed in the year 1000. And the book is about globalization and how people reacted to it. One of the things that was very striking to me is that there were anti-globalization riots so early. And when I say anti-globalization, these are riots against expat merchants and who are living, and in the case of the riots in Cairo and Constantinople, are Italian merchants who are living much more luxuriously than anyone locally is, because they've been given concessions by the rulers. There's also at this time, very sadly, a huge trade in slaves, and the forced movement of people from not just Africa, but also Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And this forced movement begins centuries before the transatlantic slave trade began. One of the things that happened when people encountered each other in the year 1000, or rulers learned about other societies, was that they often converted to the religion of their more powerful neighbors. And the religions that are the main world religions today, so the ones that 92% of believers in the world believe in, so Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, and Buddhism, all start to gain traction in the year 1000. In terms of trade, I've talked today about laborers who are working full-time in Song Dynasty enterprises who mass produced export goods, particularly ceramics, in large quantities. And the arrival of these ceramics, Chinese ceramics, in the Middle East forced the local potters to compete with the Chinese producers, and that led to the copying of vessel shapes, vessel types, and also motifs. The Chinese were importing vast quantities of fragrances from and woods from the Middle East and Southeast Asia. And that trade also had an impact on local society, that many of the peoples who had been living traditionally in the forest gave up hunting and gathering and started working full time producing spices and gathering forest produce like wild birds for the Chinese market. And Francois, I'm done. I'm done 3 minutes early.
That's wonderful. I saw your 48 slides and I thought, oh my God, she's never going to make it in 20 minutes. But thank you so much for a fascinating insight into the Song Dynasty economy and its international impact. So we'll move right on to Maurice Rosabi's talk. I'll give a quick introduction and then we'll have questions and discussion of both talks afterwards. So our second speaker is Maurice Rosabi, who is a distinguished historian of China and Mongolia. He is both a specialist on the Mongol Empire and modern Mongolian culture. Maurice received his PhD from Columbia in 1970, and he teaches Chinese and Mongolian history at CUNY and Columbia. Author and editor of over 25 books, he is perhaps best known for his 1988 book on Kublai Khan, His Life and Times, or maybe it's just my favorite book, I don't know. Other important books include Voyager of Xanadu, Raban Sauma, and the First Journey from China to the West, 1992, the 2010 volume, The Mongols and Global History, and in 2013, the 450-page textbook, A History of China, volume for the Blackwell History of the World. A selection of his articles has recently also been published by Brill in a book entitled From Yuan to Modern China and Mongolia, The Writings of Maurice Rosabi, that came out in 2014. So we're very glad to have Maurice join us and present a talk on the Golden Horde, recent discoveries in Russia. Maurice, please pull up your PowerPoint.
Let me thank Itai and Francois for inviting me to give a presentation on the Soviets and discoveries, Soviet and Russian discoveries. But I want to thank, in particular, Mark Kramarowski, who put together an exhibition in Kazan about 2 years ago. And most of these images that I'll show you derive from that exhibition in Kazan. And I also want to thank Charles Halperin and Donald Ostrovsky, who wrote important studies about the Golden Horde period in Russia. They have informed a lot of what I'll be talking about in the next half hour. I want to start by pointing out that my wife believes in visualizing history. And so when I did my first paper on tea, we had to put a little tea bag in the, as you can see here, in the article in order to show people what it was all about. Then when I did a paper on rhubarb in Chinese history, we went all over New York trying to find a sprig of rhubarb I can put in my lapel. I've kind of hesitated to tell her that my next paper is on eunuchs for fear of what she might suggest at that point. jumping from the eunuchs to Mongol rule is a little difficult, but I'll try. What we know about the Mongol rule in Russia is that there was, for the most part, up until about 20, 25 years ago, there was a decidedly negative image of the Mongol role in Russia by Russian historians and by others as well. The perception was that the Mongols destroyed, pillaged, massacred, raped, and that they didn't make much of a contribution to Russian civilization. And if you look back even further in the 19th century, the great Pushkin said the following: "The schism brought about by Mongols separated us from Europe, and we took no part in the great events which stirred her, that is Europe." He believed that the Mongol separation from Europe had prevented the Russians from experiencing the Enlightenment and had led to a kind of autocracy in Russia. Others, however, during the same period, the Slavophiles were delighted that Russia was separated from what they called a decadent Europe. And so a different interpretation came in. But generally speaking, other than the Slavophiles, the most Russians felt that the impact was of the Mongols was deleterious. Autocracy, tremendous damage to the economy, agriculture, trade, a kind of cheapening of the value of human life, subversion of the arts, and terrible destruction. What I'd like to show you in the next little while is that there were other impacts that were more constructive on the part of the Russians in terms, on the part of the Mongols, in terms of Russian history. And I want to show you some images that derive from the Kazan exhibition, which attempt to buttress my viewpoint. This first group is a group of what are called paidza, passports that were given by the Mongols for travelers, for official travelers who went from one region to another in the Mongol Empire, and to merchants as well who traveled from one area to another in the Mongol domains. And this is found in Russia, and that tells you something right off the bat, that basically the one element of the contribution the Mongols made was to tie Russia up with a variety of different cultures. It created links between Russia and China. This passport was given to a merchant, and it's written in something called the Bakspa script, a script that was developed by a Tibetan that was meant to be used for Mongolian and for a variety of other languages in the Mongol domains. There was a conception of using one written language for many of the languages in the Mongol domains, a kind of world vision that the Mongols introduced. This says basically that any person who attempts to harm this traveler shall be slain and die. And you see the holes in the paidza are meant for a little string or rope to be tied around a horse, or to be tied around actually the belt of the person traveling. Let's see, we can get this next one. The Mongols, of course, were great horsemen, and their success in large part was based upon a cavalry. Their success in taking over China, Russia, Middle East was based on that. And so their art would reproduce that kind of image. And this is a silver and gold saddle with horses being depicted, made of silver and gold, with certain amount of motifs of vegetations. It's a ceremonial. It's not used in actual as a saddle. It's an artistic representation. How did the Mongols come to Russia? Well, originally they came in 1223. They were invading Central Asia at that time, and one detachment went as far as the Caucasus in 1223, defeated a Russian army, and they did not pursue their victory. They went back towards the Mongol homeland. The Russians assumed that this was the end, that there would be no further attacks uh, from the east, and so they hardly made any preparations for a renewed attack. But the Mongols were determined to come back, and in the 1230s, a major campaign was initiated by the Mongols, which was extraordinarily successful, and it was successful because the Russians were not unified. One battle after another, after one group after another, was met by the Mongols and defeated. If the Russians had been a real state and had unified rather than city states and various different kinds of peoples, it would have been much harder for the Mongols to achieve their victories. One of Chinggis's grandsons led the campaign, and by 1240, he reached Kiev, and the most important city-state of that period, and the victory was theirs. They went further. In 1241, they reached all the way to Hungary and Poland, and obviously their success based upon cavalry, these horses that you see here represented. And the result of this was presumably that they would go even further, reach Western Europe. But again, horses played a role. The lack of pasture after a while in Hungary and parts of Eastern Europe meant that the Mongols had to retreat, had to return to southern Russia, where there was abundant pasture land. The other element that shows you the importance of horses and cavalry are these belt buckles that were found again in southern Russia with dragon-like creatures represented up here in these, and again some vegetation dragon-like creature down on the bottom, as you can see here. The same is true of this series of belt buckles, again dragon-like figures, which some people believe derived in part from an exposure to China during this era. The Mongols did not remain simply as a culture that depended exclusively on pastoral nomads. They began to settle down in Russia and actually constructed a city, the city of Sarai. And there are examples here of the urban culture that the Mongols produced in Sarai. This gold bracelet that you find with a lock, which has in it an inscription from Iran. That was the other important contact that the Mongols in Russia made. They produced a kind of relationship with the Mongols in Iran, although eventually warfare broke out and between the Mongols in Iran and the Mongols in Russia over Azerbaijan and over other territories and other aspects of areas in between them. And the result was that the Mongol Empire really collapsed internally. It was not really defeated. The internal struggles among the Mongols were what led to the crises that erupted in the Mongol Empire. Here is again another example of a golden vessel here. The handles again in the shape of a dragon. It, this was a wine cup, obviously, and it was perhaps produced not by Russians themselves, but by slaves or craftsmen, artisans whom they enslaved during their conquests of Russia. Let me move on quickly because we have just a half an hour. This is a gold, what is called again a design within a cup, and again an Iranian inscription shows the close contact between between the Russians and the Iranians. More beautiful gold objects that were found just recently. These are the most recent ones, objects that have been found. The Russians have done tremendous work over the past couple of decades in terms of archaeology, the archaeology of the Golden Horde. Books galore have been published on this, on the archaeological finds that have been made. Gold cups again predominate during this time, an indication of the drinking culture of the Mongols. The Mongols were very, as you can imagine, quite determined about their drinking patterns and loved alcohol of all sorts. One of the few textiles that have been found with gold thread, gold being one of those objects that the Russians, that the Mongols loved. Just to give you some idea of the kinds of objects that were traded in this time period, you have one list including iron, tin, copper, ginger, pepper, saffron, gold, pearls, amber, silk, brocade, cotton, linen, flax, leather, tremendous slaves, a tremendous trade developed in which the Mongols in Russia played a very important role. And that, I think, is their most important contribution, the fact that they brought all of these cultures from stretching all the way east to China and all the way west to Europe, that made them such an important element in bringing about both cultural and economic exchanges. Next, let me move on to another one. This again reveals the tremendous contact that the Russians had with the Islamic world, and this inscription here indicates in this cobalt blue, turquoise, all sorts of colors in this. The inscription says, "This world is at the juncture of the will of fate, and the ruler with strong power and great hope leads it," leads the people that produce this this pottery. More evidence of an urban culture and a sophisticated culture of this time period are this vase that was used for rose water. People wash their fingers in such a vase, and there are depicted are three, and here is a blue and white, the kind of blue and white that Valerie was alluding to in her presentation a little bit earlier. This is a unique thing that was discovered earlier in the century, not just recently, but a cup with a Star of David on it that was found in Azerbaijan. And in addition to the Star of David on the outside here, 8 times repeated in an Arabic word for happiness. So this is a kind of unique kind of combination of Judaism and Islam. Many people would be delighted if that were the case these days as well. Another cup that was discovered in the lower Volga region with a gray and yellow background and cobalt blue birds, probably made by non-Russians, but found in the Golden Horde area. And that's one of the things that's most important about the artistic elements, the artistic influence of the Mongols. They were consumers, not just producers, but consumers. Have had Iranian and other craftsmen producing some of these objects for them. Another example of with birds, probably goose. Some people have speculated that they represent geese, and plants, all sorts of plants that are found particularly in Iran. Another Star of David that appears here that indicates that there were Jews in this area with that, and that the Mongols in Russia came across them. What they thought of them, we don't know. There's no indication of any sort of their reaction to all of this. And in general, the Mongols were generally tolerant of foreign religions, whether they be Buddhism or Islam or Judaism. It wasn't that they were extraordinarily fair and believers in toleration. It was mostly political. They could win over, if they could win over foreign priests and monks, and it would facilitate their rule over countries that in which they were the occupiers. So they often portrayed as tolerant, but in some cases, of course, they were not, and they prized and supported specific religions in some of their domains. In Iran, for example, and at the beginning of their rule over Iran, they initiated a kind of anti-Islamic policy. Then in 1295, when a new ruler who had converted to Islam took power, they moved away from that discriminatory policy and supported certain types of Islam. In terms of Russia, again, you would think that the Mongols would have no particular interest in supporting the Orthodox Church, but in fact, they provided the Orthodox Turks with a tax exemption and supported the church as much as was needed. They also allowed Roman Catholic missionaries. We've discovered that a whole bunch of Roman Catholic missionaries reached Russia during this period, and were not harmed in any way, were not intimidated, were allowed to meet with the population in general. This is again description of a portrait of birds bluebirds, a decorative motif, obviously found in Azerbaijan. And you can see that there was great admiration among the Mongols for great artistic representations. This particular slide is of modeled on a Iranian jug that was produced in metal, and here was produced in another material. So the Mongols, again, played an important role in promoting sort of interchanges, artistic interchanges during this time. Let me move on. I have about 2 minutes, so don't have much time here. Let me point out a couple of other things very quickly. This is a stone from a madrasa. The Mongols, eventually, the Mongols who remained in Russia, many of them converted to Islam and were engaged in building mosques, building madrasas or theological colleges in the area. And this is one example of stonework from a mosque. Also, they were heavily influenced by Armenians and had a good relationship with Armenians. Here is two figures representative in Armenian stone relief during that time. Another indication of the close connections of the Mongols and the Armenians, a gravestone that was found with an Armenian inscription, the name of the person who was buried in that particular location. What I would say, let me end up because I have just 1 minute to go, is that the perception that the Mongols in Russia and the Golden Horde was a destructive period in terms of Russian history is misconceived. There was a tremendous amount of destruction in the initial invasions. A lot of cities were devastated. Several important buildings were destroyed. But along with that, there was a tremendous contribution in terms of linking Russia up to both East and West. And that was probably the major contribution through trade and through artistic and cultural interchanges. Okay, that's it. Francois, and it's up to you.
Great. Thank you, Maurice.
Hello?
Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Maurice, for this fascinating presentation. At this point, I would like to ask the panelists if they can turn on the videos, and so we can see all of our panelists that are online. Thank you. Maybe I will start with a question, and as some of you know, I'm very interested now too with the idea of interaction, and maybe a question both for you, Valerie and Maurice. I mean, it is striking that in both of your presentation, ceramics are basically the driving engine of exchange. When we visit museums, and even when we teach big surveys, general introductions, ceramics traditionally don't play, let's say, they don't get first seat in the house when we discuss exchange. We rather talk about gold, we rather talk about ivory, we rather talk about dress and rich textiles. And in a way, ceramics become these, let's say, secondary child to the story of trade and exchange. But in both of your presentations, obviously, ceramics are the prime, or let's say the prime find that we have in archaeological sites as testimony for exchange. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts of innovative ways to bring the story of ceramics forward in our interest in global medieval interaction.
Valerie, I think he directed it at you.
Question, I know.
As you were talking, I was thinking about archival fallacy, that, you know, if we talk about ceramics because so many of them survive, especially from shipwrecks. I mean, I think in terms of innovative ways, well, I was thinking about the research that's been done on the Beilitung wreck, including Francois' essays, and maybe, you know, a way to go at this is to start with the shipwreck and the drama of a shipwreck, and then look at a ship where, like Beilitung, where you have so many different, you know, you can see this huge quantity of pots, right, and the different varieties of ceramics, and presented as a kind of, can I make a bad pun instead of a whodunit, who fired it? I mean, that's just an idea. Maurice, I'm sure you have something enlightening for us.
Yeah, I think great ideas. Yeah, well, it's interesting to me that you know, the specialists in art at universities are, for the most part, the great major graduate universities are really in painting. And there's been a sort of lack of people at the major art centers, art historical centers, of specialists on textiles, ceramics, or anything of the sort. And I think it sort of fits in with the traditional idea of the Chinese, that the scholar officials were the main group that should be of interest in terms of China, and Chinese society. It's difficult to get much information about craftsmen. That makes it very difficult to make it appealing. We have a lot of information about painters, but ceramicists and weavers and so on, almost no names. I remember when we were working on the Ming biographical project in the 1960s, late 60s, we were trying to find the names. We had identified about 600 names of officials, scholars, painters, eunuchs, even eunuchs, and could find information about them. But trying to find information about craftsmen was almost impossible. If you look through the dictionary of Ming biography that was edited by Professor Goodrich in the 70s, there aren't any artisans represented. We just fit in terms of our academic interests in around the world, I would say. In universities, you rarely find specialists in the decorative arts as teaching, particularly in the China field. I don't know if that's just an accident or it's just, I don't know. What do you think, Itai and Francois? I guess you'd be more somebody who would be able to answer that question.
Well, I guess that's a question on specialization. There are lots of archaeologists who specialize on ceramics, not necessarily as art.
But teaching Chinese art?
I'm sorry? I didn't understand you.
He just asked if they were teaching Chinese art.
No, they're archaeologists, right? So it's a different approach, basically. But I was quite struck by the ceramics that you showed. They were all from Iran and Iraq, right? And you showed none from China. Is that because there are not a lot of Chinese ceramics in these Russian Mongol sites, or?
No. There are, no, sorry, there are, But the exhibition that I used as the basis of the talk in Kazan was mostly relating to Iran and the Middle East, not so much to China. There are Chinese that have been found in some of the graves.
Great. I would like to invite any of the panelists who have a question to ask, and those of you at home, please write your questions in the chat box and I will read them out loud. So does anyone of the panelists maybe have a question?
Yes, I've raised my hand some time ago. Okay, let's
just
John
introduce yourself. Yes.
I think that one of the issues is that you are approaching it from the wrong end. The material evidence is there. Searching for biographies of makers, Maurice is, I think, a lost venture. In very few cases do we have recorded biographical information. What you must do is interrogate the objects themselves, preferably in context. The Balaton was enormously important for that. I published the first paper on the ceramic cargo of Balaton within 2 years of its discovery. We've then worked on wrecks in the Gulf of Thailand, the Panom Surin wreck, which wasn't mentioned today, which is also a stitched construction vessel with a mixed cargo of indigenous Thai or Mon Thai ceramics, Islamic wares, and Chinese wares. Quantities are small, minor material, mostly, almost certainly utility wares for the crew, not cargo per se. But these can convey many messengers. What included in the Thai wreck were a series of fragments of torpedo jars, Persian Gulf production, is a late first millennium, wide-necked, 1 meter high earthenware vessels, bitumen lined on the interior, evolving out of the Mediterranean tradition, but belonging firmly in the later first millennium Persian Gulf tradition. One of those proved to be inscribed in the wet clay at the point of production, and the inscription was in Middle Iranian. It was Pahlavi, so pointing to merchants from southwestern Iran, who of course we know were active all down the east coast of Africa and beyond. This is our first Middle Iranian inscription to be recovered in Southeast Asia, and indeed our first torpedo jars to be recovered from the region as well. So this is again opening up a whole new vista on avenues for research, but it's dependent on the ability to read the object. And I have to say, textual people are generally not particularly brilliant at that. That is not what you're trained for. But objects, material objects, culture, artifacts can provide an enormously valuable window where we're dealing in an area which is textually deficient. And dealing, say, with first millennium Southeast Asia, we have very minimal sources that speak of anything other than religious foundations. So very few that speak of social and economic dynamics that drove the region. Of course, it was the crossroads between two great engines of India and China. And in the presentation by Valerie, which is fascinating, I would have perhaps welcomed a little more recognition of the role of India in the story, which somehow got bypassed, between China and the Gulf and the Red Sea. India plays a very important role in this whole process, and was certainly a major economic engine, certainly in the from late Han times in the Chinese context right through into the Yuan period, running parallel with the trawlers in South India. So all of this, I think, needs to be viewed in a more holistic manner. Perhaps I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. Valerie, Maurice, if you would like to respond to John, please.
No, I think one makes decisions about in presentations about what to include. Of course, India is part of the story.
Okay, so I will read one question from the box from our friend Leslie Tate. For Valerie Hansen, thank you for your fascinating talk. I'd like to know more about differences in reception of the export versus locally produced ceramics. Were the imported items more expensive and so associated with more wealthy consumers? When you mentioned the riots that you mentioned in the end of the lecture, I wondered if they were pricing them, I mean the objects, the same way so that they would compete with the locally produced or on the same market, on the same consumers. So there's two questions here, yeah.
Those are both interesting questions. I don't think we have any information about pricing. I think anything we conclude has to be sort of the basis of deduction. And I think we can assume that the imported vessels cost more, especially when they were of higher quality than the local vessels. And I think the question of, who's making the money? I think that's a very complicated question. And I don't think it's something that the archaeological record allows us to answer.
Thank you. Another question now for Maurice.
I think also the question of price is really fascinating, but I don't think there's just the kind of information we need to answer that kind of question. I know that there's this big Silk Road which Valerie has kind of demolished in a sense that it's economic importance, but it was economically it did have an impact on a few merchants and a few craftsmen, but it's almost impossible to find, at least in the Chinese sources, any information about prices. Textiles were the work of women, and you didn't have too much information about textiles in that period. Song Yuan, certainly not on prices, which it's disappointing in a way, but that's what it is.
Yeah, Valerie, you in the end of the lecture mentioned very briefly the anti-globalizing or anti-global riots. And I wonder if you could say something about it, because it was very intriguing and you kind of left it to us to wonder and to compare it to our modern day daily life. So can you say a little bit about something about that?
Yeah, I was going to say I think from the point of view of the rioters, and there are three specific incidents I'm thinking about, and I would say in each case, I don't think the rioters were rioting against globalization. I think they were rioting against wealthy expatriate merchants. And so the earliest example is the Guangzhou rebellion in China. And then there's this riot in Cairo in 995 and 996. And then there's a riot, a much better documented, a bigger event that we know more about, the massacre of the Latins. And in each case, as I said, it's fueled by the resentment of the local people against these merchants who are they're foreign merchants, they're expatriate merchants living in either Cairo or I was going to say in the case of in Guangzhou or Cairo or Constantinople. But it's clearly an example where the local people are not benefiting from the trade, or do not perceive themselves as benefiting from the trade to the same extent as the foreign merchants.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Maurice, Natasha Mao from the Worcester Museum of Art asks, and she writes, "Thank you for your fascinating presentation. My question, are there different types of materials for paisa found? If so, how did the different materials indicate different social class of the original owners?"
I didn't quite get that question. If you could repeat
Natasha Mao
you were
asks,
frozen.
Sorry, Natasha Mao asks,
Yeah, I
about
got
the
that first part.
paisas that you presented in the beginning of the presentation. And she asked if there are paisas of different material, or are they all silver?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see. No, I don't think this, the difference in materials had tremendous significance. They were only in primarily the ones I've seen are gold or used in it. Actually, the Metropolitan was bought in 1994, and that one is quite similar in certain ways to the ones I showed. I don't think there's any indication of social status as far as I know. It's beyond my expertise.
Okay, thank you. There's another question for both of the speakers from, I'm sorry. Yes, there's another question from Dorothy Wong for both of the speakers, and she thanked you. And she asked, since both of you mentioned slave trade, could we know about slavery of this time period, and where did this slave come from, and what kind of work they did? And also, I would like to add to Dorothy's question, we always talk about objects that move and exchange, and we know that, you know, the sad reality, the sad historical reality is that slaves were also traded. And I wonder, when we study these things, we study on the one hand these extremely horrific histories of human beings that are being traded, and on the other hand, these objects that sometimes move in the same direction. What do we as scholars can do with this history of slavery when we think about these objects, especially ceramics that were also mass-produced, probably also with the aid of slaves, and of course architecture and other enterprises that were built most likely by slaves?
Actually, I'm embarrassed to say there is a PhD at Columbia on the slave trade between the Golden Horde and the Mamluks in Egypt, and the person who did it was a teaching assistant in my course in Mongol history, and I've just blanked out on her name. She teaches out at Arizona State University, and she's the one who's done the most work on the slave trade. If you're interested, you can get a Hannah Barker. Thank you very much. Hannah was terrific. I just have had a momentary senior lapse, as they say, but she's the one. Actually, she's come out with a book at the University of Pennsylvania Press, published her dissertation, and so it's available if you're interested. I'll let yes, pandemic brand. Thank you. Valerie, you want to take the rest?
Well,
about slaves?
I think Itai, I think that's a very interesting and very challenging question. Especially linking, because I do think we tend to think about the slave trade in one part of our brains and then the ceramics trade in another, and the overlap is certainly a good question. I was just going to say, I think we've had a big step forward with the publication of the Cambridge World History of Slavery. Is now all 4 volumes are out, including volume 2, which is about the medieval period. So I think that it makes it much easier for those of us doing synthetic work to have to be able to make generalizations about the slave trade. And the most of the slave trade that I wrote about in my book was concerning slaves, the import of slaves into the Islamic world. I mean, and there's a slave buying manual by a doctor, a Christian doctor who lives in Baghdad named Ibn Butlan. And that's a very interesting source that tells us, I mean, it's grim reading, right? It's written for a slave buyer going to a market to choose the best slaves, but it tells us that slaves were coming from 19 different places, he mentions, and they're including Africa, but also Northern and Eastern Europe. And he doesn't mention Central Asia, but we also know that at this period that the warrior, slave warriors on horseback are also a very important part of the slave trade.
Thank you. We have now a question from our panelist, Diana Yang. Diana, can you unmute yourself, please?
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you both for the very wonderful talks. I have two questions. So the first question is for Professor Hansen. So there were a wide variety of ceramics being made during the Song Dynasty. So I was just wondering, what are the main factors that contributed to the domination of Dehaware and Longquan celadons in the transnational pottery trade? And some scholars have argued that the green glaze of celadon was particularly attractive to the Muslim communities in Southeast Asia. So can you probably share your thoughts on this issue? So this is my first question.
I was going to say, I didn't know that about the appeal of the green glaze. My answer would have to do with geography, that these are kilns that are in Fujian and are located on rivers, and so that it's easy for them to ship their pots downriver to these big ports of Quanzhou and Guangzhou, but there are other ports too, like Fuzhou, right? And so I think that's a key factor, that a kiln that is located on a river has a greater likelihood of becoming a major exporting kiln than a kiln located inland that requires overland transport.
Okay, thank you. And my second question is for Professor Rosabi. Nice to meet you through the screen. So I was really intrigued by the cup with the Star of David. So I was curious to know more about the Jews that were really living under the Mongol rule Russia. So I was wondering, what were their possible social and cultural roles in that society? So we knew that like during the Song Dynasty, there were Jews actually living in Kaifeng, and they were basically merchants. So I was wondering if that's the case in Mongol ruled Russia as well. Thank you.
Well, there's not much information. I've done a couple of articles on the Jews of Kaifeng. You find a few sources on based on their stelae, the inscriptions, each time the synagogue in Kaifeng was rebuilt. But in terms of Russia, there's not much of the fact that there were Jews. We don't know where they were, what their specific status or position was. There's been a tremendous amount written about the Chinese Jews, but nothing new as far as I can see. I mean, there are probably more articles and books on the Chinese Jews than there are on Muslims in China. Muslims in China survived, well, it had a great impact. I remember giving a talk at the Asia Society on the Chinese Jews, and pointed out that they were interesting, but not really vital in terms of Chinese history. And the audience reaction was unusual. Some guy got up and said that his rabbi in Great Neck knew that there were thousands of Jews still in China, was going to fund an archaeological excavation to go out to find these Jews. Another guy said that was dead wrong, that Confucianism was
Maurice,
based on Judaism. The final straw was that some guy got up and said that Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai were Jewish. I think we've gone a little far with the Jewish stuff. I just showed it to indicate that there were Jews. I don't think there's a tremendous amount of information available about Jews in Russia. I may be wrong, but I think that's true.
I would just like to add something. I'm working more on the Western side, on the Crimean side, and actually Stary Crim, which is the Western capital of the Golden Horde, They actually did excavation and found a synagogue that was operating under the Mongols in Stary Krim.
Yeah.
And they found a very nice seal of probably a Jewish Italian merchant whose name appears both in Arabic script and Hebrew script. And they
Wow.
found it in the digs in the synagogue as well. More so in the local library or in the special collections, I guess it's in Kiev now, they found the Genizot, which are the Jewish manuscripts written by Jews under the Mongols in Stary Krim. And some of them were published. I must tell you, there's so much work to be done on that material. And Crimea for me is a very fascinating place because it changed hands so many times in the past in the 20th century. And so it was mainly with the Ukrainians, now it's with the Russians. And there's a lot of material and a lot of very good archaeology that was being done under the USSR and then later on. And so there's a lot of material and there's a lot of Jewish material and a lot of synagogues also in Feodosia. And, you know, up until the 20th century, of course.
There isn't the same kind of...
Sorry, until the 20th century, also in Odessa and Feodosia, there are very, very big Jewish communities. And so it is something that exists, you know, also from the Khazars on, from very deep in the Middle Ages, that the Khazars also operate under the Mongols. So it's just a small footnote to what Maurice just told us. Stephen Wagner also asked us about...
I think the...
Yes, Maurice, please. Maurice? Well, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I couldn't hear you.
Please, did you want to add something?
You were frozen.
Sorry, did you want to add something?
No, I was very interested in what you said about the Odessa communities, but that was later. However, the other aspects of I didn't know the material, the Jewish material. Is it in Hebrew? The material in that synagogue?
No, I think it was Mark that actually excavated it. Komarovsky, I think Komarovsky is the one who excavated the synagogue in Stary Krim. So I know he's a dear friend of yours. So it's easiest to ask him. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll get in touch with him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.
But it's fascinating material. There are many other questions. Jackie Way asks Valerie about to what extent Song Dynasty trade differs from the earlier Silk Road trade. So do we see development, change in things that move?
I mean, in a nutshell, most of the Silk Road, just given the time, most of the Silk Road trade that we talk about is overland. And one of the distinctive changes in the Sung is that we can see this huge increase in the building of Chinese ships, and then the rise of this maritime trade. And also just the obvious point that a ship can carry so much more than a camel or a horse or a wagon.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any of other panelists have maybe a question? Yes, Helen Evans from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, please. Just unmute yourself.
Okay. Like John, I'd like my people included too. Guangzhou is a place where the Armenians that Maurice talked about come together with the town. And Nancy Wu, who's from the Met, has been researching the Franciscan presence there. Do you have a great deal of more information about the Franciscans who arrived around 1300? And Andrew of Perugia has a bishopric there. An Armenian woman gives him the money to pay for it. Or is that outside of the
Yeah,
area.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the whole question.
What do you know about the Italian Franciscan missionary elements and the Armenians, whom I think of as major facilitators of trade routes under the Mongols in terms of your research?
I was going to say, for my research, I'm really focusing on the coastal towns. The Franciscans, right? There's the famous tombs in Guangzhou.
Yes.
So I mean, they're definitely, we know that they're there. But I was going to say, Maurice may have more to say.
In terms of the Franciscans reaching China or Russia, I didn't quite get the question. They were missionaries who came to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
And the Franciscans, the Franciscans' travel was facilitated by the Armenians. What more do you from Russia see?
Franciscans. There is a Russian scholar, Istvan, who's been doing this kind of research on the missions that were sent to Russia, and I don't remember his talking about the Armenians, but I may be wrong. They came in the time of Uzbek, the Russian. His point was a Russian Mongolian Khan converted to Islam in 1313, and he was trying to point out that the Mongols were tolerant and allowed all sorts of missionaries, Catholic and missionaries, to come to that region, despite the fact that he had converted to Islam. I don't know other particulars. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I'll send you the name. If you're interested, I'll send you the name of this Russian scholar.
Thank you. I'd appreciate it.
Istvan Vasari was his name. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I think this is the moment for us to draw close this fascinating conversation. And it's always nice to see that there's so much more work to do and so many more questions to answer. And I think we are all now going to run to the libraries and start doing a lot of new research based on the wonderful things that both Valerie and Maurice told us. So first of all, thank you, Valerie. Thank you, Maurice, for these wonderful presentations and for a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, my colleague Francois, who facilitated and organized with me this wonderful event, and Laura, who is always in charge of everything that is going well here, and John, who is helping out with everything that it doesn't really go well and helping us with all the technical difficulties that we are having and making sure that everything goes smoothly. And thank you to all the listeners from around the world and from New York City for tuning in. So thank you and have a lovely afternoon or lovely evening or good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.